We do not expect harmful levels of radiation to reach the West Coast, Hawaii, Alaska, or U.S. territories in the Pacific. Furthermore, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and public health experts do not recommend that people in the United States take precautionary measures beyond staying informed.
George Monbiot says he now supports nuclear power. To explain why, he joins us now from Oxford.
The extraordinary fact is that no one has yet received what is believed by scientists to be a lethal dose of radiation.
There's a growing body of evidence that radiation in excess of what the government says are the minimum amounts you should be exposed to are actually good for you and reduce cases of cancer.
放射線の影響は実はニコニコ笑ってる人には来ません。ぷよぷよしてる人に来ます。これは明確な同時実験で分かっています。環境の汚染の濃度マイクロシーベルトが100マイクロシーベルトパーアワーを越さなければ全く健康に影響を及ぼしません。昨日いわき市で答えられました。今いわき市で外で遊んでいいですか。どんどん遊んでいいって答えました。福島も同じです。心配することはありません。
It seems that nearly 1 million people have already died as a result of Chernobyl, despite what WHO says and the IAEA. This is one of the most monstrous cover-ups in the history of medicine, because everybody should know about this. Then we extrapolate through to Japan. Japan is, by orders of magnitude, many times worse than Chernobyl. Never in my life did I think that 6 nuclear reactors would be at risk.
Do they have control of the situation at the site?
No. It's still a ticking time bomb.
Americans think this crisis is over, or that some even think that maybe it's solved or it's contained. It's not. What's happening right now?
In the last 2 weeks, everything we knew about that accident has been turned upside down. We were told 3 partial meltdowns, don't worry about it. Now we know it was 100% core melt in all 3 reactors. Radiation, minimal, that was released. Now we know it was comparable to the radiation at Chernobyl. And as far as evacuation, 12 miles, that's it. You don't have to evacuate beyond 12 miles. Now they find hot spots. But in New York City, you can actually see it in the milk. You can actually see that the iodine 131 actually spiked a little bit in our milk in New York City.
What's happening now, as I'm told, is that the Japanese government are trucking radioactive material from the Fukushima disaster area where it's contaminated all over Japan. Now, what possible reason could there be for burning it as far away as that? I'll tell you the reason. It's really quite sinister and horrifying. The reason is this. That eventually, when these children start to die from leukemia, from other cancers, from heart disease, from whatever, their parents are going to want to go into court. They're going to want to sue the Japanese government, and they're going to want to have to say, in order to do that, these children were contaminated, and that's why they've got high levels of cancer. But of course, the only way that they can say that they've got high levels of cancer is to have a control group in an area that's not contaminated. For example, the south of Japan.
Speaking of Barack Obama and his policies towards America and zombies, is his biggest campaign contributions come from Exelon, a nuclear energy firm, and there are serious questions about why America is not warning its citizens about the nuclear fallout happening along the upper northwest coast.
Yeah, the northwest coast citizens are getting fried.
Well, they have called hot particles, which are radioactive little particles of cesium and strontium and plutonium falling into their lungs.
They're turning these citizens into hot pockets. Did you have one of those things? You put them in a microwave? Obama's microwaving his own people.
Well, that radiation circled the globe and it came all the way here to Pennsylvania. And about a month after that disaster, radiation levels spiked in our water.
Mangano is the executive director of the Radiation and Public Health Project, made up of scientists and health professionals.
The great majority of infants who die in the first couple of weeks of life.
And yes, you heard him right. He believes radiation traveling from Japan to the U.S. by air we breathe, getting into the rain and our food, enters our bodies. And in this case, Mangano says it's affecting particularly pregnant women without them knowing, until their newborn suddenly dies.
it goes through the placenta and into the fetus. And we know this is not something new.
But when you're in hot particles, unless there are many, 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 it's very difficult to detect a single hot particle. But that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. We're discovering by scientists, independent scientists, using air filters in Japan, that the average person in Tokyo breathed in about 10 of these hot particles every day, all the way through the month of April. Those same scientists using air filters are discovering that in Fukushima, people were probably breathing in 30 or 40 times more radiation than they were in Tokyo. Again, in the form of a hot particle. And what surprised me was that air filters in Seattle indicate that people there were absorbing 5 hot particles every day for the month of April. Now, you can't run a Geiger counter over someone's lung on the outside to determine if they have a hot particle, because those particles, those rays, don't travel outside the body. They do their damage to the local tissue. But we know they're there because the air filter results indicate that they are.
We'll start seeing lung cancer and leukemia, I think 2 to 5 years from now. And then solid cancers will start appearing 15 to 60, 70 years later. So the ace up the sleeve of the nuclear industry is the incubation time for cancer. It takes a long time for cancers to develop once you have inhaled or been exposed to these radioactive elements. And no cancer identifies its origin. And so there is already a level of cancer in society, but it's going to increase dramatically.
This is the State Library of Victoria in Melbourne. As it is, I'm not here to borrow a book, but instead to recall a time when this building and its front facade invoked the possibility of a global radiation catastrophe. In 1959, a major Hollywood motion picture was filmed here, starring prominent actors of the day such as Gregory Peck, Ava Gardner and Fred Astaire. On the Beach was a post-apocalyptic story in which there has been a major nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere. It has released such tremendous radiation that it forces our protagonists to find refuge in southern Australia, since the Northern Hemisphere is inhospitable to human life. The city of Melbourne, this building, and its facade were prominently featured in the film. It was across here that a large white banner was hung declaring, "There is still time, brother," suggesting that the survivors make the most of their time remaining before the radiation inevitably reached Australia to claim their lives. The US Department of Defense refused any cooperation or collaboration with the movie. The US government complained that the film was unrealistic since the expenditure of all the world's nuclear arsenal in 1959 was far too small to make the Northern Hemisphere uninhabitable. Unfortunately, since that era, nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants have proliferated to such an extent as to make a scenario, such as in On the Beach, a much more realistic proposition indeed. What is more, recent events on a beach some 9,000 kilometers north of here in Fukushima, Japan, are threatening to make that piece of science fiction into a nightmarish science fact. The nuclear meltdown crisis in Fukushima is not over. In fact, it has only just started. This is a documentary not about the 8.9 magnitude earthquake, nor the waves of water that killed thousands of people. Rather, it is about the greater monster that the events of March 11, 2011 have spawned. The terrible child of the great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami is a gargantuan and relentless menace that has the potential to claim victims and casualties, not in the mere thousands as the tsunami did. This new menace could be spoken of in millions, if not tens of millions of deaths and casualties in this generation and generations to come. Remarkably, what is accompanying this disaster is an incredible lack of interest from heads of government, the media, and the United Nations. In swamping and overwhelming the defenses of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear facility, owned by Tokyo Electric Power Company, the tsunami gave rise to the much greater and more permanent, monstrous spectre of global nuclear contamination. Radiation from Fukushima is still spewing from its reactors, with some potentially even more horrifying twists in the plot to come. Radioactive contamination cannot be readily understood or dealt with in terms easily grasped by the man on the street. It does not alarm our primal survival instincts that normally alert us to danger. Radiation cannot be seen. Radiation cannot be felt or touched. It has no taste, no scent, and no odor. It does not announce itself like an earthquake, or a marauding invader, or an enraged supernatural monster. But once released, radiation can move seamlessly and soundlessly through walls, tarps, and defensive barriers. It seeps into soil and water tables. It is an eager traveler, contemptuous of sovereign boundaries, oceans and continents. By taking to the wind, hitchhiking on far-flung pollen grains, or falling with precipitation. Rather than taking on a terrifying tsunami-like physical force, destroying all in its path until it is exhausted of energy, radiation is an indefatigable and deadly ghost, seemingly absent and invisible, yet omnipresent and irresistible. Once released, its lethality has, in human lifespan terms, a permanent quality, as plutonium has a half-life of 24,100 years. In high doses, radiation can kill and maim in hours. Dispersed, it can patiently lodge itself in a plant, animal, or human host, giving rise to a whole range of death-dealing ailments. If it does not strike dead the original host, it can easily kill or maim the offspring.
If a fetus, a normal, genetically, chromosomally normal fetus, is exposed to a tiny bit of plutonium that lodges in its brain, developing brain, it can kill the cell that's going to form the right half of the brain or the left arm. That's called teratogenesis, damage of a normal fetus. It also, plutonium in particular, which is highly mutagenic, lodges in the testicles. It has a predilection for testicles, and it lodges next to the spermatogonia, the cells that form the sperm, the precursors. And it's an alpha emitter, highly mutagenic, so it can mutate genes in the sperm to induce genetic mutations and genetic disease down the generations. And it takes up to 20 generations for recessive mutations to express themselves. So we're talking about eons of time for expression of genetic disease. That's the second thing. The third thing is if the man's got plutonium in his testicles, and every male in the Northern Hemisphere has a tiny load in his gonads from weapons testing days, and plutonium is still falling out. And the man's cremated. The smoke goes out the chimney with the plutonium, so you can breathe it in, another man can, and it's ad infinitum, because plutonium has a half-life of 24,400 years and lasts for a long time. But the other thing is that the body thinks plutonium is iron. It's an iron analogue. So it's stored in the liver, where it causes liver cancer. It's stored in the bone marrow to produce hemoglobin in the red blood cells, but it causes leukemia or bone cancer. It crosses the placenta into the developing embryo, which lets nothing through it, incidentally, except plutonium and a few other nasties. It's stored in the testicle too. So it's a ubiquitous. Really dangerous isotope. And from the time they discovered it in the Manhattan Project, they knew its dangers.
In the immediate aftermath of the explosions at the Daiichi nuclear plant, the Japanese government declared its nation safe from nuclear contamination, bar a 30-kilometer exclusion zone surrounding the nuclear plant. Similarly, the United States raised no alarm to its citizens downwind of the nuclear plant. Little or no consideration was given to the possibility of nuclear fallout reaching its shores. On the contrary, the World Health Organization issued a report describing how a number of people had comically poisoned themselves by taking the precaution of taking iodine tablets to protect their thyroid glands from the radioactive iodine they feared would arrive from Fukushima. Major news organizations like CNN, BBC and Reuters chimed in with a situation normal message, often citing reassurances that the radiation exposure would be no more than that received in a CAT scan. Japanese news platforms chose not to report on the radiation altogether. There were myriad commentaries on how the radiation would never see the shores of North America. As if to reinforce a mirage of safety and to quell any public concerns, there were radiation-positive news items and commentaries. Protagonists on the left and the right sounded the non-alarm regarding the supposedly benign radiation. George Monbiot, writing in The Guardian, stated that his faith in nuclear energy was strengthened in light of Fukushima and that we needed more nuclear power plants. On the right, Ann Coulter, a conservative American political commentator, declared that radiation is actually beneficial to human health. In Japan itself, the appointed nuclear safety advisor to the Japanese government notably quipped to audiences that any ill effects of radiation could be countered by the mere act of smiling in its presence. There were innumerable reassurances that if there were Fukushima radiation present, it was in such low concentrations as to be unworthy of concern. Dr. Michio Kaku was one of the few voices allowed on mainstream media, calling the Fukushima disaster for what it truly was.
That's right. This could be the granddaddy of all industrial accidents.
In December 2011, the Japanese government and TEPCO announced that they had achieved cold shutdown of the 3 reactors. This proved to be an empty milestone, as it was merely an announcement of what was on their timetable for shutdown, rather than a reflection of any physical achievement. However, a successful shutdown was in fact achieved, that is, the shutdown of any negative news about the reactors and the Daiichi plant. The government invoked Article 15 of the Constitution, permitting them to negate and suppress any reporting of the disaster they saw fit. Indeed, the Japanese media and entertainment complex fell into line. In reality, what was occurring behind the scenes from March 11 onward at TEPCO and within the Japanese government was a sordid drama of sheer panic, cover-up and disinformation.
Within hours of the accident, we now know it was like the Keystone Cops. People that are clueless, headless, just running around crazy, not knowing what to do.
On March 11, 2011, the tsunami wipes out the Fukushima Daiichi plant's water cooling systems, causing the nuclear fuel rods in reactors 1, 2, and 3 to heat up and explode. At reactor 4, there is a large hydrogen explosion. These incidents release tremendous amounts of radiation and radioactive hot particles into the air. TEPCO raises no alarm to the public. Inside Fukushima Daiichi, plant manager Masao Yoshida refuses to abandon the stricken plant, as his superiors at TEPCO headquarters are urging him to do. Instead, he pleads on the phone with Prime Minister Naoto Kan's officials that Daiichi should not be abandoned. TEPCO's president, Masataka Shimizu, makes competing calls to Kan's office, saying that the company should be permitted to evacuate all staff. Yoshida vehemently opposes this and further defies TEPCO by ignoring their order not to flood the reactors with seawater, thereby avoiding what would have been probably the meltdown of all 6 reactors and incineration of all the nuclear fuel assemblies in storage near the reactors. In Tokyo, government science advisors informed the Prime Minister of the situation with the sketchy information that TEPCO has provided them. Prime Minister Naoto Kan seriously contemplates the unthinkable, ordering the evacuation of Tokyo, a city of 30 million souls. Special Advisor Professor Kenichi Matsumoto, present at the emergency meeting, says, "In the end, talk of tens of millions being evacuated was dismissed, with fears it would cause mass panic and chaos worse than the nuclear crisis itself." Khan confesses later that he doubted privately at the time whether Japan could continue to function as a state. What this directly implies is that the decision not to evacuate Tokyo was not based on public health considerations. Rather, it was based on the necessity to avoid panic and maintain the veneer of normalcy and calm. Despite the growing radiation danger, the integrity of the nation-state of Japan and its capital had to be held at all costs. Back at the Daiichi plant, reactors 1, 2, and 3 suffer complete meltdowns, and a hydrogen explosion at reactor 4 severely damages the building housing the reactor, and a vast nuclear fuel pool stacked above it. The pool is exposed to the open air, further imperiling the people of Japan and the Northern Hemisphere to this very day. While the decision not to evacuate Tokyo and North Japan made by the Prime Minister may have avoided panic and chaos, they have only resulted in a very calm and orderly irradiation of tens of millions of Japanese people. With time, even low doses of radiation kills, maims, reduces life expectancy, causes birth deformities, and manifests itself in lesser, seemingly unrelated maladies, ranging from heightened skin irritation to severe lethargy. No level of radiation exposure is safe, and the effects are cumulative. Also, hot particles released from Fukushima are not easily detected. Once breathed in, they become internal emitters, irradiating the surrounding tissues and causing cancers. But after the Fukushima meltdown, the Japanese government inexplicably switched off all public radiation readers and meters. The government even raised the acceptable level of radiation for children from 1 millisievert to 20 millisieverts a year, the same as nuclear power plant workers. It was as if by the mere making of government decree, the biology of children had magically changed to that of an adult in terms of radiation tolerance. Radiation does the greatest damage to children and the unborn, as they have the fastest growing cells. Radiation stunts their growth and greatly reduces their life expectancy. If we are to consider what could be the health legacy of Fukushima, perhaps we should consider the Chernobyl meltdown of 1986. To date, the Chernobyl accident has been estimated to have killed 1 million people worldwide. We must remember that the Chernobyl reactor had a partial meltdown while running at low capacity. At Fukushima, there were 3 complete reactor meltdowns in reactors that were running at full capacity. These fuel rods contained not only cesium, but MOX, plutonium-based fuel. Nuclear scientist Arne Gunnarsson opined that Fukushima is at least 10 times worse than Chernobyl. Chernobyl was in a sparsely populated area. Fukushima Daiichi is in a relatively densely populated area, with the huge metropolis of Tokyo only 250 kilometers away, inhabited by 30 million people. In the year after Chernobyl, all European fresh produce and milk was banned, and food was shipped in from outside areas. In contrast, in Japan, Fukushima and Tohoku food and produce has been pushed as safe and sent and sold all over the country. Members of the popular boy band Tokyo went on TV to express their support by eating Tohoku agricultural produce.
つながっています。食べて応援続けます。
While their relative youth may aid staving off radiation illness for a few years yet, a middle-aged TV presenter, Norikazu Otsuka, was not so lucky. He ate Fukushima produce on air regularly, and in short time was diagnosed with acute leukemia and hospitalized. Some Japanese citizens have not waited on their government to be the final arbiter of what the actual radiation risk is in their country. individuals have been doing surveys with personal Geiger counters, finding and measuring time and time again areas with radiation well beyond what is deemed safe for children, not to mention adults. This is occurring not just within the 30-kilometer exclusion zone from the nuclear plant, but in major population centers 200, 300, even 500 kilometers from Fukushima. Nuclear scientist Arne Gundersen, on a fact-finding mission to Tokyo, took 5 random soil samples from around the city. Soon after the disaster,
I just went around with 5 plastic bags, and when I found an area, I just scooped up some dirt and put it in the bag. One of those samples was from a crack in the sidewalk. Another one of those samples was from a children's playground that had been previously decontaminated. Another sample had come from some moss on the side of the road. Another sample came from the roof of an office building that I was at. And the last sample was right across the street from the main judicial center in downtown Tokyo. Well, I brought those samples back, declared them through customs, and sent them to the lab. And the lab determined that all of them would be qualified as radioactive waste here in the United States and would have to be shipped to Texas to be disposed of. Now think about the ramifications for the nation's capital, whether it's Tokyo or the United States. How would you like it if you went to pick your flowers and were kneeling in radioactive waste? That's what's happening in Tokyo now.
Dr. Paolo Scampa, an eminent chemical physicist, recently announced his calculations of deadly radioactivity in Tokyo. He found that the radiation measured at Tokyo Station corresponds to 25 times the maximum permissible artificial hourly dose, that of 0.114 microsieverts per hour. His findings were reported in Veterans Today, which called for the evacuation of US military personnel from Tokyo, declaring being stationed there akin to a death sentence. Naturally, for Japanese people living within 200 to 300 kilometers from Fukushima, the same must hold true. It has not taken long for the radiation to physically manifest its presence. What is more, there is a constant stream of classic radiation illnesses afflicting children, women, and the elderly. Anything from severe lethargy, constant nosebleeds, hair falling out, and discolored fingernails, to sudden heart attacks. In Fukushima itself, people who have come to local hospitals with what they thought were radiation-related illnesses were told by hospital staff that they needed psychiatric help and were given drugs to alleviate their suffering. It is well known that many pregnant women in and around Fukushima are aborting their babies out of fear of birth defects.
And mothers like Yayoi Inuma are just one of hundreds who believe their children are already suffering the effects. 10-year-old Hana has had severe joint pain in the arms and legs, deep rings under her eyes, and extreme tiredness, to the point she sleeps for hours during the day. All symptoms of radiation sickness, say nuclear safety experts.
If it was just one thing, that would mean it was something else. But all the symptoms came at once.
When we left Tokyo for a bit this summer, she got better right away.
The gradual sickening of the population is likely unless a major change is effected. Mass evacuation of North Japan and the Kanto Plain, including Tokyo itself, cannot be deemed unreasonable. As yet, no evacuation order has been given. This despite the fact that radiation has cut a huge swath through the small nation-state of Japan. The contamination may very well render Japan mostly uninhabitable in the years to come. The irradiation of Japan and the evacuation of its eastern and northern regions that surely must take place has taken on the resemblance of some uniquely Japanese science fiction melodrama, just like an apocalyptic manga or anime plotline that has somehow metaphysically made the leap from the realm of the fantastical into a present-day reality. Fiction has become everyday fact, yet tragically, this has not truly been grasped by a Japanese and wider world public suspended in disbelief that the radiation situation merits urgent evacuation and their gravest concern and vigilance. Not only is the radiation afflicting Japanese people daily, it has gleefully ridden the Pacific jet stream, taking flight to land in North America and breach into all parts of the Northern Hemisphere. One study that was allowed to make the light of day held that 14,000 Americans had died a year after the Fukushima plant meltdown as a result of the traveling radiation. Yet no initiative has been made by the government authorities to warn, prepare or inform Americans or Canadians for the radiation onslaught. In fact, virtually all government radiation devices were switched off in North America. Radiation, of course, carries on its deadly agenda, whether publicly acknowledged or not, in places near and very, very far from Fukushima, Japan.
The map I'm going to show you tonight, I'm not making this stuff up. This comes from the Norwegian Air Institute. The reason why the Norwegians are paying attention to this is because back when Chernobyl took place, they got a little bit of the radioactivity that came out of Chernobyl landed in their country. Here's the west coast. I'm on that little island. I've been saying for a long time, we need to get the heck off. These levels, the yellow levels, is the same thing that's coming out of Japan. So don't think that it's different, it's diluted. Here we go. There's the 9th of May. Here's the 5th. The 6th. The 7th. The 8th. The 9th. Here we go, Northern Hemisphere. You can see the yellow over in Japan, right? That's the same yellow that's going to be coming our way. See that yellow right out of Japan? That's what I showed you on the other map. So those of you there's people out there saying, no, it's diffused and it's not the same. No, it's the same intensity. And I'm showing xenon gas 133 because it's one of the ones that's the easiest detectable gases, radioactive gases. Our media keeps stressing the less dangerous ones. There's hundreds of radioactive particles that are in this gas, that are coming out of these reactors.
It's just rained, so
0.04.
Right. Well, that's what that's the worst part about it is it's small little particles. It's not.
Anyway, let's go to the drain.
Feel it, it's going to be 20
and see what happens today.
Number 34 to 37 is about my average. And it's going way high. It's 10 times. Bearing in mind, 370, 340 is 10 times my background.
And this is jet stream.
So this looks like well past 20 times.
Okay. Here we go.
And again, this is my water scope.
Our measurement is done.
Thus we have a worldwide public health time bomb that is primed to explode. The lag from when the radiation poisoning and ingestion occurs to when cancer and leukemia appear could be as early as 2 to 6 years. Given the exposure to which millions of Japanese and residents of the Northern Hemisphere have already been subjected, it is for many of them only a matter of time before the cancers manifest themselves. Yet what could explain the inaction and willful ignorance of our entrusted authorities? The United Nations, the IAEA, the World Health Organization, the US government, NATO, and on and on. It is well known that the nuclear industry has long and very powerful tentacles that penetrate into and crisscross through governments, multinationals, and the defense industries. At Chernobyl, the Soviet regime wanted to hush the severity of the accident, as it would call into question the legitimacy and prestige of Soviet nuclear power. At Fukushima, we find that the Mark I nuclear reactors were designed by General Electric, who have 23 Mark I reactor plants operating across the United States, and in total has designed 91 nuclear power plants in 11 countries. Despite several engineers resigning decades ago over the design flaws of the Mark I reactor, its design was nevertheless approved for use. A Japanese media official, a week after the earthquake, speaking anonymously, stated, "The United States is trying hard to prevent Japan from exposing the role of General Electric Company by exerting too much pressure on Japan. The United States' effort is aimed at preventing further pessimism on behalf of the Japanese people towards the US. General Electric has very strong ties to the military-industrial complex and the US government, and incredibly does not pay taxes in the United States, despite multi-billion-dollar annual profits." The IAEA itself admits that it exists in order to promote nuclear power, no less. Notably, the Queen of England has 30% of her investments in nuclear energy and uranium mining. A report from Al Jazeera shed light on the money trail that funds the cover-ups of any negative news on the nuclear industry. In the report, David Biello, the energy and climate editor at Scientific American Online, said that obtaining clear information on incidents such as the Fukushima Daiichi disaster is very difficult. Biello states that there is a lot of secrecy that can surround nuclear power because some of the same processes that can be involved in generating electricity can also be involved in developing a weapon. So there's a kind of veil of secrecy that gets dropped over this stuff that can also obscure the truth. The Nuclear Energy Institute, a policy organization for the nuclear industry with 350 companies, which of course includes TEPCO, has not responded to journalists' requests for information on funding research and chairs at universities. M.V. Ramana, a researcher at Princeton University specializing in the nuclear industry, reveals that most of the funding for nuclear research does not come directly from the nuclear lobby, but from governments who receive donations from the lobby. Ramana continues this by saying, "The Department of Energy has a very close relationship with the nuclear industry, and they sort of try to advance the industry's interest. So those people who get funding from that, it's not like they, the researchers, want to lie, but there's a certain amount of, shall we say, ideological commitment to nuclear power, as well as a certain amount of self-censorship. It comes down to wondering how their next application for funding might be viewed," he said. A Department of Energy program called Major Areas of Research concerns not only engineering, but also nuclear weapons. As a case in point, the genesis of plutonium and depleted uranium from power plant nuclear fission finds its way into weapon systems of the US military.
The utilities make money by selling electricity, that's all. They don't have to build the reactors, it's all subsidised and paid for. I mean, no other industry has that sort of subsidisation, and do you know why? because it's the prodigal son of the weapons industry. And when nuclear power was begun by Eisenhower in the 50s, atoms for peace, the weapons industry said we require nuclear power as a sort of Trojan horse, camouflage to hide behind. And then everyone said it was safe. The Japanese didn't want nuclear power after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but they were talked into it. So it's a really wicked, wicked industry.
The use of depleted uranium munitions in Fallujah, Iraq, has resulted in contamination and poisoning of civilians and US soldiers. Horrifying birth defects among the offspring of Iraqis and returning US soldiers, and the lack of acknowledgement of this disaster, merely hint of a wider and sinister agenda by the US government and the nuclear industry. In Japan itself, an independent report revealed that the Fukushima meltdowns were preventable had the government and TEPCO followed basic safety recommendations. Instead of shoring up emergency power systems, TEPCO successfully fought off any regulations that would cost them money or expose the lack of safety controls at their plants to the public. The report also placed blame on the government for colluding with TEPCO by permitting internal complacency in lieu of official regulations stipulated on the books. Moreover, nuclear plants have been restarted despite hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens protesting against them. It seems that the government is the nuclear industry, and the nuclear industry is the government. Certainly, this very, very cozy relationship between TEPCO, GE, the United States and Japanese governments, the military-industrial complex, and even international nuclear research academia, plus the intertwining of nuclear engineering and nuclear weapons interests, goes a long way to explaining why any negative news about the reactors and their radiation is strongly suppressed and ridiculed. Instead of focusing on the perils of radiation and taking preventive action, the powers that be seem hell-bent on provoking new disasters. The drums of war and nuclear confrontation in the Middle East are being pounded at this moment. Another towering spectre of radiation has raised its head, that of nuclear war. The United States and NATO are moving inexorably to force regime change in Syria and Iran, partially to protect Israel, a known nuclear weapons power, and the only one in the Middle East. Russia has stipulated that it will intervene if Syria and Iran are attacked by NATO. In the lead-up to the November 2012 elections, the temptation for Barack Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, to wage open war, deploying US troops on a vilified foreign enemy, and have the US public rally around the commander-in-chief, may prove too much. The problem is that it just may trigger a hot and nuclear war in the Middle East and escalate globally. If we are to confront this crisis, we will have to deal not only with the ongoing radiation release, but three major shadow points that threaten to escalate the crisis to a possible extinction-level event. Firstly, the three reactor cores from Fukushima Daiichi reactor buildings 1, 2 and 3. After much denial and distortion, it has emerged that all three have been melting through the soil and ground beneath the building since March 12, 2011. This is what is dubbed China syndrome, where a superhot melted down reactor core penetrates the floor of its building and bores and burns its way into the ground below, all the way to China metaphorically, contaminating the soil and water table. If a reactor core finds water beneath, it can easily react with it and cause a steam-powered hydrovolcanic explosion. Digging and catching up to these three very hot runaway reactor cores in order to encase them in concrete. To prevent this would be a monumental task for TEPCO. Each reactor core already has a 500-day lead on any search and entombment party. TEPCO have cried poor already on issues of the Daiichi nuclear plant cleanup, and have so far based their responses on cost and shareholder considerations. Next, there is the matter of the plutonium-laden seawater that has been repatriated back into the Pacific Ocean. It has been projected that it will take 5 years for the radioactive plutonium seawater to encompass the whole of the Pacific Ocean. There is little indication that the plutonium release into the ocean has been halted to this day. Bluefin tuna have already shown up on the California coast with radioactive cesium in their bodies. The seafood basket of the world, the Pacific Ocean, along with its ecosystems and biodiversity, is imperiled beyond all measure. The consumption of any Pacific seafood must be vigorously discouraged, yet little has been done to prohibit it. Even green groups have been relatively silent on this issue for reasons unknown.
The New York Times is reporting that 200 tons of radioactive liquid are being poured into the nuclear reactors and the fuel pool at Fukushima every day. Well, where's it going? If it's going in, it's coming out. And it's coming out two ways. It's coming out as radioactive steam, and it's coming out as radioactive water. Offshore radioactive readings in the ocean have gone up and are now over 3,000 times higher than the standards that are routinely expected. That's not coming from the air. The ocean's too big to be polluted by what's coming out of the airborne releases. It's clearly leaking from the trenches into the ocean. They haven't found the leak, but the only source of quantities of radioactive material large enough to pollute the ocean has got to be leakage from these trenches.
Finally, the last escalator is reactor number 4 at the very heart of the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Reactor 4 itself was empty, but it housed a very large and uncontained spent nuclear fuel pool on its roof. Due to the explosion, the Reactor 4 building is severely damaged and has 1,535 fuel rod assemblies that are immersed in water but exposed to the air and the elements. They are also stacked high in the air on elevated racks like mere warehouse inventory. Moving these rods must be done while immersed in water and in heavily protected structures in an environment that is now highly radioactive. The crane equipment designated to perform this task was destroyed in the tsunami. Work has only just started now, in late 2012, on reinforcing Reactor Building 4 with a view to removing the 1,535 fuel assemblies. The projected time that it will take to secure and remove the fuel assemblies is 2.5 to 3 years. So sometime in 2015 or 2016. Another 7 or 8 magnitude earthquake is all that it would take to collapse the building and allow the fuel rods to crash to the ground, exposing them to the air and sparking the burning of all that cesium into the atmosphere. Such a fire cannot be put out with water once it is ignited. Contact with water creates a pyrophoric reaction in which oxygen from the water itself is extracted by the super hot rods to continue and enhance the burning and thus affect the release of radiation and cesium. Even a rocket-propelled grenade attack by North Korean frogmen would do in Reactor 4. The collapse of this single building would be so catastrophic, since the subsequent release of the 1,535 fuel assemblies would easily trigger a huge radiological fire that would quickly spread to a nearby common spent fuel pool a mere 50 meters away, with a further 6,375 fuel assemblies. This represents about 50 times the amount of radioactive cesium released from Chernobyl. There are a further 3,511 spent fuel assemblies in the Daiichi plant, and if they were absorbed into the fire also, it would be a cesium release 85 times that of Chernobyl. Mitsuhei Murata, a respected diplomat and former Japanese ambassador to Sweden, declared that if Reactor 4 collapses, the whole of the Earth's northern hemisphere would have to be evacuated, and does not rule out a global human extinction event. Nuclear scientist Arne Gundersen and physician Helen Caldecott have both stated that they would leave the northern hemisphere if Reactor 4 collapsed.
However, if there's another earthquake and Building 4 collapses, which contains the cooling pool with fresh fuel, I'm going to evacuate my family from Boston.
If the spent fuel pool at Reactor 4 hits the ground, that is literally the end of Tokyo, Yokohama, and most of Honshu. There's no question about it. It has visually been observed to be leaning in the past month.
But the rest of the world is doing nothing to help the Japanese because it's going to poison us in North America, Europe, all the way around the world.
Every damn scientist, the best of the best from Europe, Russia, China, America, should be in Japan or studying this around the clock and making recommendations. They got to get not only outside the box, they got to get outside the planet to start thinking about this, or there isn't going to be any planet left. It's that bad. Right. The tonnage just in spent fuel pool number 4 is over 260 tons of rods, fuel rods. And remember, they were new ones. Most of them are used. This is what we're told anyway. There were MOX fuel rods in there, and when a fuel rod has lived its useful life, boiling water, it's far more dangerous than it was as a brand new fuel rod that first gets inserted into the reactor vessel. It's all nuts.
It would almost certainly spark mass evacuations to the southern hemisphere. It is indeed very possible that the radioactive scourge could engulf the entire planet and spark a major die-off of the human species and the animal and plant life we live alongside and depend upon. The characters in On the Beach knew they were doomed from the outset. Yet more than a gloomy surrender film, On the Beach was ironically a plea to its audience. The banner declaring there is still time was perhaps a desperate cry from the year 1959 to the future to highlight the potential dangers and horrors of nuclear power and radiation in order to galvanize its audiences to make better choices, take action, and demand answers to bring about happier tomorrows. The inexplicable absence of any credible government or multilateral response, or even reasonable coverage from mass media outlets, suggests that these institutions are captured by the international nuclear industry. It seems we the people are alone on this one. There is still time not to savor before we die, but to speak out and act in order that we and our brethren do not die out. If we act, we may be able to salvage something of our environment and protect our children. If inaction and indifference is to be our response, then we are, for all intents and purposes, no matter where we live across the globe, all standing on Fukushima Beach together, waiting for the lethal radiation to take us en masse. We will be judged by our children, one way or another.
I dreamt last night the moon was so bright it melted the walls away. And it wasn't alarming when I saw Prince Charming come into my bedroom and say,
let me persuade you to come to the place where tomorrow meets today.
Ooh!
Bigger and better cities with gadgets. Forward progress.
If you were a scientist, you were it.
Your Excellent Science, I am your faithful servant.
And tomorrow.
Building a new world.
When did all this begin, Dad?
Well, son, it's a very old story. It's so old it's hard to say when it really began. Could have been back in 1540 when Copernicus identified the Earth as a speck of dust moving in an orbit around the sun. Or it could have been in 1905 when a young German physicist arrived at a fundamental truth, that matter could be converted into energy and expressed it in the equation E equals mc squared. Then there were other dates. 1937, the first industrial atom smasher. 1942, the first nuclear chain reaction. 1945, the bomb. Somewhere in the course of these events, the dawn came up on the atomic era. It's going to have a tremendous effect on our town down there, son. It'll be felt in every town in America. And it won't matter if they make ships or shoes or sealing wax. With atomic power will come benefits to mankind that we can as yet only imagine.
I've got to call the governor. Sir, I do. I think you've got to talk to him immediately. Do it immediately. We're operating almost totally in the blind. His information is ambiguous. Mine is non-existent. I don't know, a couple of blind men. Now I have to stagger around and make a decision here.
In 1945, in the aftermath of war, scientists were heroes, particularly the physicists who had built the atomic bomb. They are men, said Life magazine, who wear the tunic of Superman and stand in the spotlight of 1,000 suns. In the public imagination, atomic scientists had harnessed a terrifying power which could literally reshape the world.
We knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Many of the scientists who had worked on the atomic bomb felt a deep sense of guilt about what they had done. They were convinced they now had a moral duty to use the immense forces they had unleashed to better, peaceful purposes. What they did not foresee were the demands that would be made on them when their science came out of the laboratory and into the world of politics and big business. They would lose control and be forced to compromise and to deceive.
So all of a sudden we found that as scientists and technologists, we were capable of changing in a massive way the framework in which society functioned. I and many others felt that nuclear power represented a major energy future for the world. You have to understand that this was the first time that mankind had ever found an energy source which wasn't a routine natural phenomenon. Fire, of course, comes every time a lightning strikes a forest. Nuclear power was something else completely. We made it. And our ability to give the world what appeared to be, and still does appear to be, a limitless energy source for the future, was to any scientist and engineer probably the most exciting philosophic concept you could find.
Today, at Shippingport, Pennsylvania, we began building our first atomic power plant of commercial size. Mankind comes closer to fulfillment of the ancient dream of a new and a better Earth. The scientists have provided us with an example of nuclear science at work. In this baton, there is a small source of neutrons. I bring this source of neutrons over to this place in which we have uranium, and we set up a bit of atomic fission. This will move the marker on the scale and finally light the light, and the project will be started.
The President of the United States has just started off electronically the groundbreaking power shovel 1,400 miles away in Shippingport, Pennsylvania.
In this general mood of enthusiasm for science, politicians began to look to atomic power as more than just cheap electricity. It became the way to a better world.
Это были годы больших надежд. Только что умер Сталин, пришел к власти Хрущев, и атомная энергия рассматривалась как средство для достижения лучшего уровня благосостояния народа. Тем более, что мы все тогда были загипнотизированы ленинским лозунгом. У Ленина есть такой лозунг. Коммунизм – это значит советская власть плюс электрификация всей страны. Вот электрификация – это атомная энергия плюс советская власть, и значит коммунизм.
At the very same time as Eisenhower began construction at Shippingport, Russia suddenly announced it had already built the world's first nuclear power station. What the Soviets did not reveal was that it took more electricity to run the plant than it produced. Then in 1956, another country entered the nuclear race. In this case, the atom's role was to recapture the glories of the past.
Tomorrow, Her Majesty the Queen, here at Calder Hall in Cumberland, is to open the first nuclear power station in the world to operate on an industrial scale.
Our prosperity in the Victorian era, wrote the government's scientific advisor Lord Chernobyl, was due to the men who put Britain 80 years ahead in the use of steam power. Our prosperity in the coming century will depend on learning how to exploit the latent energy in uranium.
Uranium. Well, now that is uranium. That little black thing I'm holding in my hand, 2 pounds of that size of uranium. And the potential energy which could be given off by this when properly used is equal to the energy, or the heat if you like the word better, produced by 2,600 tons of coal. That is uranium.
Atomic scientists, by a series of brilliant discoveries, have brought us to the threshold of a new age. It is with pride that I now open Calder Hall, Britain's first atomic power station.
The British government announced that by 1965, half the country's electricity would come from nuclear power.
Now, Dr. Leslie, we, see, it seems to me, in the building of this great place and its operation, have actually got ahead of the Russians and of the Americans.
Yes, the atom is on its way to brighten our towns and to help manufacture our most dependable and indispensable household servant.
In the late 50s, the Atomic Energy Commission made films that portrayed an atomic future in America. Scientists designed nuclear cars, planes, and rockets. Others predicted whole new cities powered by vast atomic engines. If somehow a product could be atomic, it had to be good.
The family car, which are now being developed with atomic energy. Even your toothpaste may be a product of the atomic age.
Да, я считаю, что, в общем, это был золотой век физики. И вообще появление энтузиазма у ученых, у специалистов. Они многое могут, многое могут. Вот, что у них какие-то большие возможности появляются.
Science for the world. A dynamic world moving rapidly, flying, reacting to flashes on the radar screen, watching schedules where everything is calculated down to seconds and fractions of seconds. Science has permeated our very existence and can no longer detach itself.
The station is to be situated on the shores of a forest lake. During the rest period, a magic silence reigns around the building site.
But now, just when the scientists were being swept along on a wave of publicity, they began to discover it was going to be far more difficult to produce nuclear power than they had first thought. The problem was the cost of building the reactors. They were proving too expensive to compete with conventional fuels. In the Soviet Union, this led to increasing pressure to build fast, often without proper protection from nuclear radiation. In February 1957, the planner in charge of the whole nuclear power program died from an accidental burst of radioactivity.
Давили на нас, конечно, экономические факторы. Желание сделать подешевле, подоступнее эту энергетику, эту энергию. Ну, естественно, хотя мы понимали, что надо делать станцию безопасно и так далее, но все-таки экономика, она очень сильно владела нашим сознанием. Они настолько быстро двигались, что кое-что не успели просто еще сделать. И поэтому, может быть, мы недостаточно уделяли внимание рассмотрению вопросов обеспечения безопасности, в особенности в части тяжелых аварий.
Then, in October 1957, there was a major accident in Britain.
Emergency at Windscale atom plant, and the milk from 200 square miles of farmland is condemned as radioactive.
The core of the reactor caught fire and spewed high levels of radioactivity across northwest England. The radioactivity released was far worse than the public was told. It led some scientists to question the speed at which the technology was being pushed to compete with fossil fuels. They included the scientist who had built Windscale, Christopher Hinton. He had been put in charge of implementing the government's plans for cheap electricity.
Hinton was a thoroughly honest man, and when he found that all sorts of bogus tales had been told about the relative costs of electricity from nuclear energy, he was shocked. He told me this, that he was absolutely shocked. He realized that the estimates of the cost of nuclear energy compared with the cost of coal energy were cooked. And when I said to him, why didn't you do anything about it, he said, well, I couldn't because the thing had gone too far. You see, so much had been committed then to a nuclear future.
No more shillings for the gas. Mother just splits an atom and supper's ready.
It must have been some billions that they'd already spent. It was too late.
It is, of course, a cliche that we're living at a time of such rapid scientific change that our children are accepting as part of their everyday life things which would have been dismissed as science fiction a few years ago. We're living perhaps in a more rapid revolution than some of us realize.
The politicians were now committed to nuclear power. In 1960, a Labour politician, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, suggested an idea for a party political broadcast. To the hymn Jerusalem, the camera would rise from waving fields of corn to reveal an atomic plant.
A conscious, planned, purposive use of scientific progress to provide undreamed-of living standards and the possibility of leisure, ultimately, on an unbelievable scale.
Nuclear scientists were now being carried along by a political enthusiasm for what science could achieve. Yet few of them in Britain, America, or the Soviet Union knew how to fulfill the promises they had made.
There's a new dawn breaking over our world, the hopeful dawn of the atomic era. What benefits it will
But two large American corporations, Westinghouse and General Electric, had already invested millions of dollars in nuclear technology. For them, there was no way back. In 1961, the new chief executive of General Electric told his staff, "We're going to ram this nuclear thing through."
We can move forward to new and even greater achievements in the atomic era. This is the hope that awaits us in this new dawn's early light.
Control over nuclear technology had passed from the scientists to the industrialists. They were now about to take an enormous gamble to make nuclear power not only practical, but profitable.
I'm Bert Wolf. I had General Electric's Peaceful Nuclear Power Program. And this is a building which is made to model an actual boiling water reactor. We can come right over here to a facility where down low in the cavity there is the boiling water reactor.
General Electric and Westinghouse took the simplest form of nuclear reactor, originally designed for submarines, and redesigned it on a gigantic scale. These were then offered to power companies at knockdown prices. The manufacturers decided to bear any extra costs themselves. They gambled they could start a bandwagon which would make the nuclear business profitable. The key figure was the salesman.
We would sell one at a time, and each time we sold one, we'd have a celebration. I can recall when we'd have meetings and someone would come in and said, we sold a plant to somebody, and we'd all stand up and shake hands and go out for lunch and have wine and toast each other. It was a great celebration. Then in the late 60s, we began selling these by the tens, so it became a real business.
The plants were sold often before they had even been designed. The power company accepted on faith the manufacturer's claims that because the reactors were big, they would achieve economies of scale. These sales were then cited to the next buyer as proof of the soundness of the manufacturer's claims. In the process, the reactors became bigger and bigger. And it worked. The two corporations sold dozens of plants at home and abroad. Only Britain refused to succumb.
A giant of limitless power at man's command. Man is building a brighter future for his children and his children's children in the new world of the atomic age.
But senior nuclear scientists were worried about safety in these enormous plants. At the center of the reactor was the uranium core. Its heat powered the generators. The cores were now so large that if for any reason the flow of water to keep them cool were lost, they would melt. The scientists feared that such a core could then burn its way through the floor of the containment shell. In theory, there would be nothing to stop it emerging on the other side of the world. They called it the China syndrome. The doubters included Alvin Weinberg, the man who had designed the original submarine reactor.
As long as the reactor was as small as the submarine intermediate reactor, which was only 60 megawatts, then the containment shell was absolute. Now that's not quite right because...
When you say the containment shell was absolute, do you mean it was safe?
It was safe. But when you went to 600 megawatt reactors and 1,000 megawatt reactors, you could not guarantee this because you could, in some very remote situation, conceive of the containment being breached by this molten mass. And that change, I would assert, occurred as a result of this enormous economic pressure to make the reactors as large as possible.
In 1964, a team of scientists working for the Atomic Energy Commission studied the possible consequences of a nuclear accident. They concluded, "We have found in our present study nothing inherent in reactors or in safeguard systems as they now have been developed, which guarantees either that major reactor accidents will not occur or that protective safeguard systems will not fail. Should such accidents occur, very large damages could result."
And that's when the nuclear dream began to fall apart.
In 1965, scientists advising the Atomic Energy Commission tried to force the manufacturers to make their reactors safer.
Good evening. Well, as I'm sure you've heard, we're going to have an atomic power plant here in New York. The Atomic Energy Commission has granted to Consolidated Edison permission to build a nuclear steam electric generating station at Indian Point in Westchester County.
Westinghouse had already built a small atomic plant at Indian Point. Now they applied to the AEC for a license to build a giant reactor on the same site. At the same time, General Electric proposed a massive plant just outside Chicago. The scientists on the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards were worried that a core melt so close to large cities could cause a disaster. They drafted a letter to the chairman of the AEC, Glenn Seaborg, which would by law have to be published. It said they would only agree to the plants if the manufacturers redesigned all future reactors to stop a molten core escaping if an accident, however unlikely, occurred. Seaborg was an ardent proponent of large reactors.
We think that it will be possible to build huge nuclear power reactors that will produce electricity at the rate of millions of kilowatts and desalt seawater at the rate of hundreds of millions of gallons a day.
Seaborg asked for the letter not to be published. The impact on the industry might be serious, he said, and the public might misunderstand it. He and his fellow commissioners would deal with the problem in private.
All I can say is that we tried to take such steps as we could to follow their advice, to make the changes that would make them safe.
So what did you say to the manufacturers?
We had meetings with the manufacturers and discussed the issue with them. I think they were doing the best they could, and I don't know that we ever made a tremendous push to try to get them to change their whole manufacturing system.
Why not?
Oh, I think it was, at that time, not regarded as a feasible approach.
We asked General Electric to come in and discuss how they might cope with this, and in effect they came in and showed the problems that would arise with their containment and indicated they didn't think they wanted to continue selling power reactors if they were going to have to deal with the core melt problem. Westinghouse showed something called a core catcher, but no proof of how it would work. Neither company was anxious to deal with the problem, obviously.
Weren't General Electric in effect threatening you? They're saying, if you insist on this, then we'll just pull out of this.
It was a kind of threat, I think, yes.
What would have happened if you had said, I think these plants that are being built, these enormous plants by General Electric and Westinghouse, are potentially dangerous? What would have happened if you'd said that?
Well, that's a hypothetical question.
You had the power to do it. What would have happened?
I don't think we had the power to stop them. Well, we could have refused to license them, of course. But again, I think that in the context of the times, it's not a question that makes much sense.
Indian Point and the other reactors were built without the redesign the committee had asked for. Instead, the AEC ordered a massive upgrading of the capacity of the emergency cooling systems to prevent a core from ever melting. In effect, the manufacturers had got their way, but they had set a terrible trap for themselves. In contrast, in the Soviet Union, the grandiose nuclear plans of the 50s had remained on the drawing board. The Soviet planners were unconvinced they could be constructed cheaply. The physicists and engineers spent their days designing reactors that would not get built. Then, in the mid-60s, Brezhnev came to power. He believed that the road to communism lay through giant technological projects. The nuclear power program began again. It was dominated by Anatoly Alexandrov, a famous physicist who had designed what was known as the RBMK reactor. His team planned giant versions to be built around Soviet cities.
Я считал и считаю сейчас, что атомная энергетика чрезвычайно важна, потому что никакого топлива, ни газа, ни нефти, ну и в меньшей степени угля, но тоже не хватит для существования человечества даже в течение тысячелетия. Она чище, экологически чище всех остальных видов энергетики.
The idyllic picture of a nuclear Eden masked a reality in which safety was barely even considered. The reactors were built at great speed to cut costs and to fulfill the Soviet plan. Some had no protective containment at all, despite the high pressures of steam. Large amounts of water, contaminated by radiation from the reactor core, were pumped into giant open ponds.
А потом решили строить уже крупный в 1 миллион киловатт. В 1973 году был построен первый блок, и вслед за ним следующий. Но поскольку я участвовал в этих работах, был на площадках, где строилось, то я видел, что в погоне за успехом как бы потеряли чувство меры.
Complete safety for the attending personnel is ensured at the atomic power plant. The slightest radioactive contamination can be detected with the aid of radiation monitors. At the exit of the washroom, there is a dosimetric installation. This will not let you out if there is the slightest trace of radioactivity about you.
При Брежневе началось активное разложение, воровство, пренебрежение к делу и так далее. И когда к концу 70-х годов эра Брежнева достигла своего апогея, это совпало с максимумом развития ядерной энергетики, и стало это просто все понятно, и это видели многие. Попытки как-то решить это дело путем служебных записок не имели значения. Нужна была публикация в крупном журнале.
Koryakhin and a fellow engineer wrote an article in the newspaper Communist. It openly challenged Alexandrov. It criticized the lack of safety in the design of the plants, where they were sited, and the growing question of what to do with the nuclear waste. It caused a sensation.
Была создана специальная пресс-конференция, где было сказано, что эта статья клеветническая, что это все не так, все это неправда, хотя это было уже многим ясно, так как вот это, вот, я бы сказал, научная мафия во главе с Александровым и Институтом атомной энергии, но она заняла удобное положение, потому что все награды, ордена, звания, поездки за границу и всякие, как у нас в России говорят, пироги и пышки доставались им, а синяки и шишки доставались простым инженерам в других институтах. Ну, это довольно широко бывает в жизни. Часто бывает в жизни.
Britain, meanwhile, struggled just to make her plants work.
So far, the first of the advanced gas-cooled reactors being built here on the Kent coast at Dungeness hasn't produced a single watt of electricity. Ordered at a cost of £80 million and due to be commissioned in 1972, it might just start producing electricity in 1977. And really, nobody has a clue how much it's going to cost us. So, why is it that things have gone wrong? For a start,
it is with pride.
When Calder Hall was opened, we were leading the world by 3 years. I can only feel terribly sad because I've seen that lead thrown away. I find it difficult to put it any other way.
A nuclear generating plant is as harmless as a chocolate factory. But a lot more nuclear power is needed. Nuclear power. The power to keep America turning on.
In America, the enormous nuclear plants ordered in the 60s were nearing completion. The engineers in charge were beginning to discover the trap they had set themselves by failing to redesign the containment. If a molten core could not be contained, then the emergency systems to prevent a meltdown would have to work, whatever happened. The engineers had to anticipate everything that could possibly go wrong. In the enormous complexity of the plants, this was proving impossible.
One of the main things we began to discover is that our theoretical calculations did not have a strong correlation with reality. While the regulations required emergency core cooling systems, pumps and valves, we didn't really have any basis for knowing that those pumps and valves would actually prevent a meltdown of the reactor. because the degree of complexity of trying to predict what will happen inside a huge reactor in the midst of a pipe break, we couldn't make any judgments because we didn't have any facts on which to make judgments.
During the winter of 1971, a series of tests of emergency core cooling systems were performed at the AEC's private testing site in Idaho. Accidents were simulated in a small model of a reactor. In each case, the emergency systems worked, but the water failed to fill the core. Often it was forced out under pressure. Despite this, both the industry and senior members of the AEC argued that the full-size safety systems were safe enough.
I think what happened was the federal government and the nuclear industry decided that the absence of proof of danger was almost as good as proof of safety. In other words, even though we had done experiments that cast doubt on whether the safety systems would actually work if we had an accident, we still had that backup that, well, maybe an accident won't happen while we continue to work to perfect the design of the emergency system. Now, we couldn't announce to the public that we, having told the public that the plants were safe, we now had to disclose to them we were wrong, and in fact that all these safety systems we told you about, actually they might not do any good. My goodness, the uproar would have been, we all probably would have been fired. That would have been the end of this wonderful technology from the standpoint of us. And we just couldn't admit that we had been wrong. And plus, of course, you understand with this one experiment, it didn't prove that the emergency systems wouldn't work in all circumstances.
What is your principal concern right at this minute? Well, my principal concern is that we got an accident that we never been designed to accommodate.
On March the 28th, 1979, a series of human and mechanical errors at the 3 Mile Island plant exposed the core. It reacted with steam and produced hydrogen, which exploded. None of the emergency teams could understand what was going on inside the reactor. Then suddenly, this helicopter detected a large radioactive cloud drifting towards the nearest town. The voices of the commissioners in charge of the disaster were recorded by a dictaphone that had been left running on a table.
What was their time scale involved there? Hours. Hours before what? Before you had a core melt. Before you had a core melt? You would have hours till when you were generating fission products in a core melt kind of situation through the containment. I think, we got the best we got, Joe. And they're not coming up with answers. We got the... Well, don't you think as a precautionary measure there should be some evacuation?
Probably, but I must say it's operating totally in the blind, and I don't have any confidence at all that if we order evacuation, we won't move people from a place where they've already gotten a piece of the dose they're going to get into an area where they will get, another piece. They will have had 0.5 of what they were going to get, and now they move someplace else and get 1.0. Now, Joe?
Yes, sir.
It seems to me I've got to call the governor.
Yes, sir, I do. I think you've got to talk to him immediately.
Do it immediately. We're operating almost totally in the blind. His information is ambiguous. Mine is non-existent. I don't know, a couple of blind men now have to stagger around and make a decision here.
Don't we know that it's been stopped? For instance, we just lost all communication with the control room.
For 4 days, the engineers at the plant watched helplessly as a bubble of hydrogen grew inside the damaged reactor. What they feared most was a further massive explosion. But they knew that if they tried to force the bubble out of the reactor, it might move downwards and completely uncover the core. They would then face the nightmare of a meltdown. The engineers were trapped by the consequences of an accident no one could have anticipated. It was a point they made to the commissioners again and again during the incident.
It's a failure mode that's never been studied. It's unbelievable.
Well, the thing that impressed me was how little we really knew about the situation. It was very hard to figure out what was happening. There was a lot of confusion on everyone's part, both on the company's part, the government's part, and a lot of other people who were participating. And I think this had a very strong effect on the public. Basically, to see all the men in the white suits or white lab coats who are supposed to know on TV, basically scratching their heads, made a lot of people wonder whether things were as much under control as they had been told.
3 Mile Island. The President's Commission estimated the cost of the accident could reach $1.8 billion. That's a lot of money to pay for a power plant that may never work again. But 3 Mile Island wasn't the first nuclear accident, and it won't be the last. In 1979 alone, there were 20 nuclear incidents that could have led to the catastrophic meltdown of an American nuclear power plant. Don't get sold on nuclear power. We can't pay the price.
Their energy policy will benefit the nuclear industry and the oil companies, and they have given only lip service to the solar industry.
There were protests against nuclear power throughout the world. In the public's imagination, it was transformed from something good to something bad. Much of the anger was turned on the nuclear scientists. It emerged that they had deliberately concealed many of the risks and uncertainties they had discovered at the very time when they were publicly promoting the wonders of nuclear power.
We would, in effect, have solved the energy problem forever, permanently, which in itself is just an extraordinary new dimension in human experience, to have energy which is the ultimate raw material.
We recognized that there was a risk, but we always deemed the risk to be really acceptable. But now I guess I'm more mature, older. I realize that the decision of what is acceptable is not something that we technologists can make. It's something that the public makes.
Why did you think it was something you could make then?
You know, I guess it never occurred to me to ask this question. The nuclear enterprise had always been, well, it started out as a secret enterprise, of course, and the notion of the public being intimately involved in very complicated technical issues which went way beyond the competence of any member of the public, it just didn't seem that that was the right way to do it. And I think the basic question is, can modern intrusive technology and liberal democracy coexist?
The power rises sharply. The rated power level is exceeded.
I keep in my safe records of the operator's telephone conversations on the eve of the accident. It makes one's skin crawl to read them. One operator telephones another and asks, the program here states what must be done, but a lot has been crossed out. The other thinks for a moment and then says, act according to what has been crossed out. In Kiev, we set off for the nuclear power station. It didn't enter my head that we were moving towards an event on a planetary scale. On the following day, when I went into the ruins of the reactor in an armored troop carrier, I had that sense of anger, that there were no solutions, no technical remedies worked out in advance. Of course, we had said such an accident could only happen once in 1,000 years. But who said that this once would fall in our year 1986?
Это голос Валерия Легасова, академика, одного из моих героев моей повести «Чернобыль», человека необыкновенной и трагической судьбы, человека, с которым я встретился осенью 1986 года.
Legasov had been one of the main architects of Russia's nuclear program. Now he led the fight at Chernobyl, repeatedly flying through the radiation above the blazing reactor. As with 3 Mile Island, an improbable sequence of errors had led to an explosion and a molten core that had now started to burn its way through the foundations of the reactor. A tunnel was frantically dug directly under the plant by hundreds of volunteers. Liquid nitrogen was poured in to freeze the ground underneath. By luck, the nitrogen gas also began to stifle the graphite fire. And then on the 5th day, for reasons that still no one understands, the core began to cool. Despite this, throughout the disaster and the terrible dangers, Legasov remained a staunch defender of nuclear power.
The maximum dose was 0.7 roentgens per hour. Over the reactor, we got between 0.3 and 0.5 roentgens. Do you think we'll be able to have children? Yes, don't worry. Are you sure? I've been working with radioactivity since 1964, and I've got kids, don't worry.
In the months that followed, Legasov changed his mind. In a long-taped interview with the then Soviet MP Yuri Sherbak, he gave a damning criticism of the whole nuclear power program. The problem, he said, was the demand that was made of the technology.
Удивительная была встреча наша с Легасовым, удивительный разговор. Он как-то очень доверительно, очень откровенно вдруг начал мне рассказывать все боли, все то, что он пережил в Чернобыле.
It's easy to think or imagine that the enemy is the nuclear reactor, but the enemy isn't technology. I have come to the paradoxical conclusion that technology must be protected from man. In the past, the time that includes the old reactors, the time that ended with Gagarin's flight into space, the technology was created by people who stood on the shoulders of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. They were educated in the spirit of the great humanitarian ideas, in the spirit of a beautiful and correct moral sense. They had a clear political idea of the new society they were trying to create, one that would be the most advanced in the world. But already in the generations that succeeded them, there were engineers who stood on their shoulders and saw only the technical side of things. But if someone is educated only in technical ideas, they cannot create anything new, anything for which they are responsible. The operators of the reactor that night considered they were doing everything well and correctly, and they were breaking the rules for the sake of doing it even better. But they had lost sight of the purpose, what they were doing it for.
Then 2 years to the day after the accident, and for unknown reasons, Valery Legasov committed suicide.
Oh, this world is at a tremble with its strength and mighty power. They're sending up to heaven to get the brimstone fire. Take warning, my dear brother, be careful how you plan. You're working with the power of God's own holy hand. Atomic power was given by the mighty hand of God. Atomic power, it was given by the mighty hand of God.
In the golden age of science, at the time when society had its most optimistic view of science, it basically had a wrong-headed view of science. It had the view that this form of the technology was the inevitable form that it had to take, and that if that was the form it took, then it must be the right form. 40 years later, we have a similarly naive view. It's no longer tinged by hope and optimism, it's tinged by pessimism and fear. But we still have this view that society can't shape technology, that the form that the technology takes is the form we must accept. And just as it wasn't true in 1950, it's not true today. This is not a story of technology run amok, although that's how many people would understand it to be. The history of nuclear power is a history of political and economic and social decisions being made about a technology. And the key decisions weren't made by the technologists. They were done in the business realm. What science and technology gives you is a range of possibilities. And those possibilities can take you in any number of directions. It's potentially a liberating force. But to get there, society has to stop sleepwalking and start realizing that it's not a scientific choice, it's not an engineering choice, it's a moral choice.
Well, George, does that answer your question?
It sure does. It's given me a whole new perspective.
After World War II, there was a scramble between America and the USSR to develop ever more powerful nuclear arsenals. If you're a digital satellite viewer, press red to find out more. Next here on UK TV History, we look at the definitive account of Hitler's death.